Would you please take your Bibles with me and turn in them to Genesis chapter 39. I don't know about you, but when I read through the Gospels in the New Testament, I find great comfort in the fact that the demons are scared to death of Jesus. That they curl with fear on the appearance of Jesus. That is a comfort to me. Because those things scare me. The demonic realm is very intimidating to me. And to see them cower with fear on the arrival of Jesus Christ, it gives me confidence. It emboldens my hope. It drives away fear. And similarly, in this passage, what I think the narrator is seeking to demonstrate is that evil itself is just as intimidated at God as the demonic realm is intimidated at his Son. In other words, evil is a light thing for God in overcoming. It's not light in that he'll hold it accountable, but it's light in that he can take evil and redirect it towards something unbelievably good. And that's what we see happen in this text this morning. You know, it's possible, if you're like me, to go through our Christian lives as though we were on a roller coaster. And when we're at the top of the roller coaster, we feel as though God is good and everything's going as it should be. But when we get down into the valley, we think that God's not in the valley like he was on top. Or sometimes if you've gone through roller coasters and there's daylight and then you go into this passageway and it's just pitch black. You can't see your hand in front of your face. And we sort of see our Christian life as in the daylight when everything's going as it should. God's great. God's involved with me. Everything's just ship-shape. But the moment you enter into the darkness, you think God has left the premises. What I want you to see, what I think the narrator wants you to see, is that even evil is not a rogue agent with God. As Charles Spurgeon would say, even a solitary dust particle floating through the air goes in just the way, moves in just the exact way God wants it to go. And therefore, God harnesses evil and he uses it. And it's just possible that in difficult times, we actually get to see the contours of God even better than in the good times. And we see this with the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, where it's in weakness that you actually see God's power in a way previously yet unseen. And so we have this morning Joseph, who is the pinnacle of weakness. He's separated from his homeland. He's not just separated from his homeland, he's separated from the promised land in which God especially dwells, is the way they understood it. And so Joseph is separated from his family. He feels separated from God. He's a servant. He's in this really difficult spot. And it might be easy to think that God's not present there. But the narrator takes such great care to tell you that God is as much was with Joseph when he was elevated to when he was put down and actually put in prison. So, I want you to see this morning that the narrator of Genesis delights in almost seemingly every episode of the book in showing you, the reader, this great obstacle, this seemingly insurmountable obstacle. And as you see it, you say, well, how's God going to win through that? And then the narrator says, watch and see. And we see God overcome every hurdle, every obstacle, climb every mountain that you thought was standing in the way of his promises being fulfilled, and he overcomes them every time. And so Genesis is a book that is meant to elicit faith in you and I. And say, if God can overcome this, what can't he overcome? That's the idea. We look at this and we see one of the men of God seemingly separated from God. For all these reasons, different homeland, away from the promised land, by himself. He doesn't have any allies. He's completely alone, as it were. But I want you to look at how this narrative begins and how this narrative ends. Look at verse 2. Very beginning of the narrative. The Lord was with Joseph. He became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. 8 times Yahweh will be named in this passage alone. Verse 23, how the narrative ends. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So what the narrator wants you to see is when Joseph was going gangbusters and he was in charge and everything was going just the way you'd want it to go in these unfortunate circumstances, God was with him. They were happening because God was with him. And then he wants you to know, when all hell breaks loose and the bottom falls out and Joseph's now demoted instead of promoted and he's put in prison, Psalm 105, I believe it is, will say that his hands, his legs were in shackles. It gives you a very three-dimensional view of how bad it was for Joseph in these quarters. The narrator wants you to know, and reader, he was with him there too. In other words, don't view Joseph's circumstances like a roller coaster ride where he was up when he was in charge and he was down when he was in prison. That's not the way God sees it. God has one consistent line in redemptive history, even in the stuff that you call bad. And that's where it gets tricky. Because God will call it bad too. So at one point, when our circumstances are evil, or in Hebrew, ra'ah, it's just bad, calamitous, terrible, God will call it terrible too. He will do it as well. But He's using it in such a way that it will lead to glory. And that's where we tend to part paths with God. We're together in calling what Potiphar's wife did to Joseph. We're together with God in saying, that is evil. That's wrong what she did. And God says, I agree. But I'm going to use it in an unbelievable way. Because you see, Joseph, it was me that ultimately brought you here using your brother's evil actions towards you. And I brought you here because a famine is coming, and it's because I've blessed you so exponentially in Egypt, you'll get promoted. And it's only by you being promoted that when you get lied about and you have to go to prison, you'll go to the king's prison. And it's in the king's prison that you'll meet the king's servants, so that when the one servant gets released, he'll know about you to be able to tell Pharaoh, which will then promote you to be second in charge of all of Egypt. But Joseph doesn't see that there, and you and I don't see it here when the evil befalls us in the right here and the right now. But Joseph didn't either. And what's a blessing in this narration is to understand that even without seeing, Joseph believed. And this is what we, friends, are called to do as well. But it's the only way we can respond with belief is to believe that God is in the good as much as He's in the bad. He's everywhere throughout this text. This text is inundated with God showing up in every way, shape, and form. Look at verse 3. We've already talked about verse 2 and 23. Look at verse 3. His master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So even his master recognized it. Then verse 5. From the time that he made him an overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. 5 times all will be used in this passage. And then verse 21. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. You see, it's seemingly beyond our comprehension to believe that the deepest, darkest evils can be used by God in the most magnanimous way. We look at the evils that befall us and we say, God is not in them. And He's not in the evil, but He uses the evil in a way that's better than you could possibly ask or imagine. And in case you're wondering how that's possible, you can look at Joseph or you can also look at Jesus, because technically speaking, the greatest atrocity that ever happened on planet Earth was not what happened to Joseph, was not what happened at the Holocaust, was not what happened with the communist regimes, is not what happened in earthquakes and tsunamis and the like. It's not in any of those things as bad as they were. The greatest evil that has ever befallen planet Earth is when God's own Son was hoisted up and crucified on the cross. And it was out of that evil that we're saved. And I want you to see what the narrator's trying to prove. That God is so unbelievably amazing that He can take the darkest things where we all shut our eyes and close our ears and say it's so evil, and He can turn that into something spectacular. Friend, it's only in you believing that you will respond properly when evil befalls you, like it befalled this man who wrote, I've decided to follow Jesus. You will only represent God well when you believe that God can work through darkness. If He can't work through darkness, you might as well get on the gravy train of the health wealth gospel and say that God wants me to have a Lamborghini and a mansion. And if I don't have that, there's something wrong. Because that's the trajectory you're on if you don't think God can use pain. It's God's using pain that demonstrates just how big He is. If God can't work through pain, He's not a big God. But the fact that He can work through evil demonstrates just how unbelievable He is. And it will only then allow you to encounter the deepest struggles in such a way that God receives glory. But if you don't think God's in and working through the evil, you're going to part ways with God. You're not going to bend the knee like you should. And you, friend, will be like the seed that is choked out and receives its root going no deeper because the rock is hard. As soon as persecution hits, that plant wears out because it wasn't ready to say, God, I believe that you can work in the dark things as well as the light. That's the problem. The rocky soil ultimately believed that God could only work in life when it was peachy keen. And when, like Pastor said so many times, a master is playing, dog owner's playing with his dog, and the dog gets the rag and he's rolling him around the kitchen, and the dog's enjoying it until the master starts slamming him into the cupboards and the fridge, and all of a sudden the dog's saying, "What is this? Everything before was like I like it, but now you're causing me to question your goodness." But friend, I don't believe that I am an oddity when I tell you that I've seen God most clearly in my pain. It's not to say I haven't rejoiced in God and experienced His splendor in Him giving us the house He's given us and the kids He's given us and the wife He's given me. I see His splendor in those things. But I've held Him more intimately in the pain than in any of those things. This is who God is. But I want to stop a second and I want to point out to you that God sees the pain. He sees the evil, and it will be dealt with. The evil in this text, along with the brothers putting him here, is Potiphar's wife and the lies that she tells about Joseph. Joseph is essentially set up for failure. It's interesting to note that in all the Bible, the only two people in the Bible that are referred to as being beautiful in form and appearance are Joseph and his mother Rachel. So they must have been these magazine cover people, these movie star people, that they were just unbelievably beautiful people to behold. And it's said about Joseph, and he's a servant, and he's an elevated servant, and he's working in Potiphar's house, and this woman comes to him daily after he refuses her advances. It gets to the point where she actually commands him to do what she's asking him to do, which, as I understand it, was something that was semi-acceptable in having servants, that they essentially were called to do whatever you wanted them to do. You owned them. So when you begin looking at this woman, you got to ask, what does God think of this woman? And it's so fascinating. The narrator is not someone who screams from a pulpit. It's someone more who just nudges you along. But in her recounting of the story, if you study who this woman might look like, what she might be like, you begin to find her as unsavory as she is as you read between the lines in the text. So I just want you to imagine, because we're getting God's perspective of this woman, I want you just to imagine how she craftily tells this tale. When she recounts the story first to the servants and then to Potiphar upon his return, you begin to understand that she's like the Proverbs wayward woman who comes to this young person on the street and says, "My husband is far away." It's fascinating that she first talks to the servants and then to the husband. Was Potiphar on a distant journey? Was he somewhere else? So you understand her timing is when her husband is away. She comes to the servants and she avoids calling Joseph by his name. She simply refers to him, which was probably a racist slur, and she calls him a Hebrew. So she wants to depersonalize. You understand, she's afraid of getting caught in her actions. So she wants to depersonalize Joseph because she does not want the servants to side with Joseph. That's what she's afraid of, because then they'll side with Joseph to Potiphar. And of course, she's afraid of all that. So she comes and she says, this Hebrew, she plays on the elitism of the Egyptians. You'll notice later in Genesis that the Egyptians didn't eat with the Israelites. So she's playing on that. She's saying this despicable Hebrew. You get it, don't you, Egyptian servants? Then she plays the servants against Potiphar, which maybe there was a reason that the servants didn't like Potiphar. So she says to them, he brought him to us. Notice, who is she associating herself with? The servants, right? She's their master. But in recounting the story, she wants them to back her. And so she says, he brought this Hebrew to us. I'm in your group. We're together, right? To laugh at us. And then when she makes her case to Potiphar, she spins all the guilt on he himself. And she says, you brought him here. You're the one that did this. And so she wants to get as far away from any eyes being on her. So she puts it all on Potiphar. It was his problem. So I want you, and if you've ever been lied about, you see that it's seemingly worthless to pursue the lie, because a liar that's lied about you is really good about lying about you. And we see this in the text. But there's a subtle clue in the text that demonstrates that not only is God not oblivious to what this woman is doing, even Potiphar himself is not oblivious at what his wife did. Because you notice in the text that he puts Joseph in the king's prison. Commentators are uniform in saying that the normal consequence for this behavior would have been immediate execution. But Potiphar likely believes Joseph's story, doesn't believe his wife, but he finds it politically expedient and maritally expedient to just imprison Joseph versus kill him. He doesn't want to go the full route because he actually probably believes Joseph. So what we find here is that the narrator paints this woman in such a way that you see her as God sees her. God sees the pain. The evil is not without notice. So this woman will be dealt with. But what I want you to especially see, and what's so wonderful in this text, is that thus far through Genesis, we've seen only rare moments of faith. We've seen quite a few in Abraham. We've seen some in Isaac. We've seen less in Jacob. But now, when we get to Joseph, we see faith decision after faith decision after faith decision. It is so unbelievably refreshing. In fact, Pastor Kent Hughes writes this of Joseph. He says, a CAT scan of Joseph's soul reveals no spiritual malignancies anywhere. It's beautiful that for the first time in Genesis, we're finding someone who responds to this world believing that God is as big as He actually is. That even evil cannot run rogue on God. And Joseph gets it. And I find it so fascinating that throughout the Scriptures, God seems to delight in people who actually understand Him. They actually get Him and they respond in like fashion. Just consider a few. You've got the Roman centurion that comes to Jesus and wants Him to heal his servant. And so Jesus starts walking in that direction. And he says, whoa, 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 whoa. Jesus, I'm a man in charge, like you're a man in charge. And I know that if I want something to get done, I send someone and they get it done. And I know that you can do the same. So you don't actually need to come to my house because you can get it done from right here. And Jesus looks at him and He says, you get it. You get me. My own people don't get me, but you get it. You understand. It's a beautiful thing. Another place we see it is when Jesus heals 10 lepers. And only one of them is a Samaritan. The least likely of the 10 to understand Jesus is the Samaritan. He doesn't have the religious and nationality upbringing like the rest, like the other 9. But he heals all 10, and the Samaritan returns to him and thanks him. And Jesus says, didn't I heal 9 more? Weren't there 10? This is just one. And you see, the problem is that these other 9 think they're going back to something that's better than me. That's the problem. But you, and you being a Samaritan, get that I'm better than anything you could go back to. Any house you could go back to, any wife you could go back to, any kids, any family, any job. I'm better. And you alone, out of the 10, get it. You understand the treasure that's looking you in the face. And so you return to the field, to buy that field, having said goodbye to everything you had, because I'm the first thing you came to. You get it. Your faith has saved you. You see it again with the unclean woman that comes into Simon's house, and she bathes Jesus' feet with her tears and washes them off with her hair and pours expensive lotion over it. And Simon's looking with judgment upon this intimate sign of affection. And Jesus says to him, Simon, she alone in this room is getting it right. I entered your house and you didn't wash my feet. But she's doing it with her own tears and wiping it not with a towel but with her own hair. She understands my worthiness and you don't. She gets it. She understands it. She understands that her whole life should be thrown in with me in the most intimate way. She understands it. Another passage in the New Testament, Jesus sits at the temple and he watches everybody place their money in, and he sees everybody give out of their abundance, and he sees a widow come in and she gives a very small amount in comparison. But Jesus walks away and he says, she did better than the rest because she considered God worthy and capable to care for her when she had nothing. Her faith is better. That's the idea. And there are time and time again throughout the scriptures where God sees people who get it right, but they're rare. They're rare. It's the Joshua and Caleb. It's not the 10 other spies. It's just 2. More often than not, unfortunately, God is dealing with people who don't get it. They don't respond appropriately. A case in point is Elisha, the prophet. He's on his deathbed, and King Joash comes to him, and he's so afraid. It's as though in losing Elisha, he's losing the Ark of the Covenant. It's his connection to God. And so he comes to Elisha and he says, Oh, you're dying. The chariots of God are leaving us. You're the one. And Elisha says, I want you to do something. Take an arrow and take a bow and shoot it out the window. And so Joash does. And he says, so will be the soaring victory over your enemy, Syria. Now I want you to take the arrows and I want you to hold them in a cluster and I want you to beat them against the ground. And Joash does, and he hits it 3 times, probably thinking this is incredibly odd. And Elisha on his deathbed gets after him radically for not beating in total, reckless abandon because he's so leaning into God. And he says, Joash, you will overcome Syria now only 3 times, as many times as you hit the arrows, when you could have annihilated them. In other words, you're on the fence. One leg you're standing on with your own strength, and one leg you're leaning on me and on the Lord. And I'm telling you, Get off the fence. Jump over to the side of God and lean into Him with all you have. And that is what Joseph's doing here. He's leaning in to God. You catch when he gives this golden speech to this woman. All she says is crass, short terms over and over and over again. Manipulating, she moves from sleeping with her to just laying with her, cuddling as it were. She's doing all these things, but they're all short, they're all ugly, they're all crass. Joseph's speech is this golden, eloquent speech. How could I do this to my master? He's entrusted everything to me except for his own food. And how could I do this to God? To which she could have easily responded, "What God? Look at you! The God you mean that sold you into slavery? The God that's turned his back on you? That God?" But Joseph is resolute in his trust, knowing that he is prepared for whatever onslaught she gives him. You catch that in the speech. This is Joseph. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing to see. John Walton, a professor at Wheaton College, tells a story about a missionary, and I want to read it to you. It's from his commentary on Genesis, and he writes this: "I once heard a story, which I have been unable to trace, that tells of a missionary who was getting ready to go home after long years of service to an African tribal people. As the people gathered on the last day to bid their farewells to this beloved woman who had served so faithfully, they brought gifts to express their gratitude. One man presented her with a shell whose appearance was entirely unremarkable. The missionary, however, recognized it as a shell that could only be found in an area several weeks' journey from the settlement. When she commented to the man about this, his reply was that the journey was part of the gift." And what I want to say to you this morning is that God is as concerned about where you end up after the trial as how you go through the trial. You're going to end up in a magnanimous place of righteousness. That's where you're going to end up. We know that because in Genesis 38, Judah ended up in that place, in a total place of righteousness, but he looked like an absolute fool. If you're reading through the Bible, you've read through this year with us, you've read through Ruth already, and Naomi tells her daughters, tells the townspeople, "Call me Mara. Call me bitter, because God has dealt harshly with me." But by the end of Ruth, she's carrying this wonderful baby that God gave her. And they say, "God has given you another son, Naomi." And so Naomi ends up in a place of righteous grace of God, but she looks like a fool when she gets there. Jonah ends up as an incredible evangelist, as it turns out, but he looks like a fool when all the Ninevites respond. Are you tracking with me? In other words, God is too big to let you ultimately fail. The question is, will you look like a fool, or will you look consistent with who God is when you get there? And friend, you've walked with God long enough to know what it feels like to look like a fool when you get there. I shared with you before, my good friend Tony, he's a pastor in First Baptist in Calumet in Michigan. The previous pastor, Pastor Nolan, used to say, "Tony, I know dogmatically that worrying works. Because 90% of the things I worry about never happen. His point is that, Tony, I've lived all my life thinking God's not with me in the thing I'm worried about. But I've always been wrong. God's always been there. And it always turned out better than I thought in the end. And He's not even in heaven yet to see how amazingly it actually did turn out. And how all the pieces fit together far beyond his vision. But Joseph seems to get it. And the question, friend, is do you? Do I? Is our God big enough in the trial to say, He's here? I don't feel Him. I don't see Him. But I know He's here. I know there's somebody in the hallway. I know He's there, even though the room is incredibly dark. And I'm going to allow that to bring faith and confidence and resoluteness in the midst of this awful, tragic pain. Because for God, it's not just the end result. It's my faith in the journey that matters. Let me give you a startling example of this. Kim Riddlebarger wrote or quoted a portion of his dissertation giving an overview of B.B. Warfield's life. B.B. Warfield was a Princeton professor that theologians credit with having a profound influence on our understanding of the inspiration and the authority of God's Word. And he did this as a Princeton professor. And so the strength in the Bible, of our understanding of the Bible, God used B.B. Warfield to invest that in some of us, even though you might not even be familiar with the name. But I want you to hear about his life. Soon after Warfield married Annie Pierce Kincaid, who was also from noble stock, the newlyweds journeyed to Leipzig. During their stay in Europe, an event occurred that would forever change the Warfields' lives. While walking together in the Harz Mountains, Mr. and Mrs. Warfield were caught in a violent thunderstorm. Annie Warfield suffered a severe trauma to her nervous system from which she never fully recovered. She was so severely traumatized that she would spend the rest of her life as an invalid of sorts, becoming increasingly more incapacitated as the years went by. Her husband was to spend the rest of their lives together, giving her his constant attention and care until her death in 1915. B.B. Warfield could not have foreseen just how constant and difficult a demand this was to become, and how, in the providence of God, this would impact his entire career. Warfield's remarkable literary output, no doubt, in large measure, is due to the frail condition of his wife and his amazing devotion to her. With the pen, he was a formidable foe, as O.T. Alice recalls. I used to see them walking together, and the gentleness of his manner was striking proof of the loving care with which he surrounded her. They had no children. During the years spent at Princeton, he rarely, if ever, was absent for any length of time. Macon recalls that Mrs. Warfield was a brilliant woman and that Dr. Warfield would read to her several hours each day. Macon dimly recalled seeing Miss Warfield in her yard a number of years earlier during his own student days, but notes that she had been long since bedridden. According to most accounts, Dr. Warfield almost never ventured away from her side for more than 2 hours at a time. In fact, he left the confines of Princeton only one time during a 10-year period, and that for a trip designed to alleviate his wife's suffering, which ultimately failed. In the mysterious providence of God, it was the nature of his wife's illness and his devotion to her that ironically provided the greatest impetus for his massive literary output. Personally vital and energetic, he did not allow his wife's illness to hinder him in his work. He was intensely active with voice and pen. Thus, his creative energies were focused in two directions beyond his wife, his writing and the classroom. As caretaker for an invalid wife, Warfield spent many hours each day in the confines of his study. And friend, I could go on and on and on. One of my major heroes, John Piper, shares that as a teenager, his acne was so profound that he had to go, I can't remember how frequently, I think it was weekly, to go to the doctor to have his face effectively burned, which would in hopes eliminate it. But he said it left his face looking so sheer red on Friday that he was too embarrassed to go out during the weekend. And he said what that ended up doing was bringing enormous amounts of time having been spent with the Lord. And now we see the output of the pain. So friend, my closing question is your God big enough to work through pain? Joseph's God was, and he wouldn't look like a fool at the end. The question is will we? I don't want to. I don't want to. I've started repenting every time I say, this is a story of my life. Because it's not, and I say it when pain comes. Because it's not the story of my life, and it's not the story of yours. Your story is a story of incredible redemption that you haven't quite yet seen yet. Are you living in line with that redemption? Or are you denying it's happening? I don't want to deny it, and I trust you don't either. I'll ask the musicians to come.